In this presentation, we'll begin by acknowledging, even though we won't be reading, some classical works by writers from the world of ancient Greece. Before we do that, however, let's get an overview of what we mean when we refer to the classical world. When we read the classics, we refer specifically to the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Most of you recognize the difference between the Greek and the Roman worlds, and you probably also recognize many aspects of their cultures that overlapped in the roughly 1,000-year period between the ascent of the Greek Empire and the fall of Rome. For example, many Roman writers, including those we'll acknowledge here, got their stories and their material from Greek writers who wrote centuries earlier. The overlapping in architectural detail between ancient Greece and ancient Rome is evident to most, and even though Rome emerged as the Greek world was in decline, the Romans borrowed heavily from the culture of the Greeks. On this first slide, we see a trio of Greek writers and some works they are associated with. Because of their historical distance, we simply don't know that much about the worlds they inhabited beyond some very basic historical and archaeological evidence. For example, even though we have known for thousands of years that the Greek poet Homer is credited with writing the two great epic works of ancient Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the actual architectural discovery of the ancient city of Troy didn't happen until the early 1870s. For these reasons, we are inclined to associate Greek literature with a more mythic tradition, simply because all of the evidence available to modern people doesn't allow us to form a complete picture of that world. The writers we will consider this week include the Roman poets Lucretius and Virgil, and although we won't be reading them, we'll acknowledge also the poet Ovid, who borrowed and adapted from the Greek poet Hesiod, and the natural historian Pliny the Elder. However, simply because the Roman world was more recent and is therefore more accessible to the modern imagination, we know more about it. Well, we know next to nothing about the Greek poet identified as Homer, except for the fact that he mentions his own blindness. We can construct biographies of some of the key writers of the Roman world, including Lucretius, Virgil, Ovid, and Pliny. Therefore, our relationship to the Roman world, though still heavily influenced by a mythic sense, is shaped more by history. That story has been retold recently by the well-known Renaissance scholar Stephen Greenblatt, whose 2011 book, The Swerve, pictured here, not only accounts for the work's controversial and to the eyes of medieval Christian authorities disturbing character, but also explains the process by which De Rerum Natura was rediscovered and then gained new popularity more than 1,000 years after it had faded into obscurity. The work is controversial because it advances the ideas of Epicureanism and atomism. In a single sentence, Epicureanism is a pre-Christian belief that basically holds to the idea that individuals should live in pursuit of reasonable, modest pleasure and should trust themselves in that pursuit. Atomism is basically the idea that the universe is composed of tiny units, atoms, which combine to form the substance of the physical world. By adhering to this belief, individuals in the pre-Christian world were therefore liberated from the tyrannical machinations of Zeus, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the other temperamental deities of the pre-Christian world. Even so, these ideas were distressing to 15th and early 16th century church authorities, as they seemingly advocate for the presence of individual aesthetic morals in a self-created rather than a God-created world. It can be argued that the foundations of modern scientific theory are found in Lucretius's work. Please take a moment to read the materials which discuss Greenblatt's book and provide some brief commentary. Then take a look at the short excerpt from Lucretius's longer poem De Rerum Natura that I've attached to the content page to see how this brief passage advances these controversial ideas. Our next poet, Virgil, was in his teenage years when Lucretius passed, and when we consider the passage of Rome's poetic torch from Lucretius to Virgil and then to Ovid and finally to the natural history writings of Pliny the Elder, we can see a cultural line which proceeds through the birth of Christ. Virgil presents us with the concept of the pastoral, an important idea and a key term inherited from the Greek poet Theocritus and others. Emerging from the idea of the shepherd tending to his flock, this term is applied to all kinds of poetry which feature images of rustic, peaceful, rural life. It is also easily appropriated to Christian spirituality and is the word from which we get our term pastor. We use the terms pastoral and bucolic to describe works, either of art, poetry, music, or literature, which capture that sense of being in peaceful country settings apart from the threats and corruptions of the city. Please take a moment to review this slide to familiarize yourself with this important term. Before we consider Virgil as a well-known writer of pastoral poetry, we will acknowledge his best-known work, the Roman epic The Aeneid, which can join the Homeric epics, features of the Homeric epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He is also known for his Georgics, which follow the example of Hesiod and have a conjoined artistic and instructional purpose in their treatment of themes related to farming, animal care, orchard care, and estate management. His pastoral collection is called the Eclogues, and I've linked you to two of the better-known ones. The first Eclogue features the conversation between the shepherds Tityrus and Meliboeus, or Melibea, as he comes to be known later. Please read this slide and the two handouts, the first and the fourth pastoral Eclogues, and consider the questions posed towards the bottom of the slide. Feel free to do any additional internet research as you see. The fourth Eclogue, the story of Polius, is also well known. Please read this passage and take note of the Christ-like characteristics to which Polius is credited. Basically, you'll see that the world's hopes are invested in this young shepherd boy who will bring forth a return to the Golden Age. Medieval Christian writers and theologians saw in this poem not only the anticipation of the birth of Christ, remember Virgil died in the year 23 BCE, but also a return to a golden age as a result of the Messiah's return. In this example, we do well to keep in mind that some 1300 years later, the Italian Florentine poet Dante would feature Virgil prominently in his medieval epic, The Divine Comedy, a tribute to his status as the Roman poet who predicted and anticipated the birth of Christ. Two other figures are Ovid and Pliny. Best known for his works Amores and Metamorphoses, or the Book of Love and the Book of Changes, Ovid's works deserve mention in this class even though we won't be reading them directly. Here we will acknowledge that his work The Four Ages of Man follows patterns established by Hesiod, and in this way he shows the Roman borrowing of Greek ideas. Our final figure from ancient Rome is Pliny the Elder, whose work Natural History retained its influence for over 1500 years following his passing. It was considered an authoritative guide to the plants, animals, trees, rocks, and other elements of the natural world. A naval commander by training, Pliny was able to travel extensively and to gather information about the known world, which he recorded in his journals, which later came to be called his natural history. In a brief section from Book 33, which I've not assigned here, we see Pliny in a rather conservationist mindset, complaining that it is unnatural to desecrate and dig up the landscape to gain access to its precious metals. Here he advocates an early version of the NIMBY, or not in my backyard, argument. Pliny is also noteworthy because of his premature death during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of the seaside city of Pompeii, in which he inhaled noxious vapors while attempting a daring rescue by sea. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, is credited with recording the most vivid eyewitness accounts of this tragedy that felled a. Let's summarize quickly. The Greek poets, especially Hesiod, Theocritus, and Homer, established patterns that Roman poets, especially Ovid and Virgil, picked up on and adapted to their own purposes. Both groups express interest and concern about how humans should live in accordance with natural rhythms and in proportion to their own resources. We refer to these motifs as pastoral and bucolic. Both Greek and Roman poets wrote in the pastoral mode, which reflected an idealized rural landscape and showed the balance and harmony to be realized in a simple rustic life. Although not achievable in historical fact, this pastoral image reflects an early longing for a manner of living in harmony with nature. Let's conclude there. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this system of content delivery is working for you.